Thomas Frank's new book is entitled Listen, Liberal, or Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. He's a Salon Politics and Culture columnist. His many books include What's the Matter with Kansas, Pity the Billionaire, and One Market Under God. And one book that doesn't get mentioned a lot, but I enjoyed very much. I think, Tom, first of all, welcome to the program. And secondly, I think this was your PhD thesis, if I recall correctly, The Conquest of Cool.
Yeah, that's right.
And the reason why I mentioned that book is not only because I enjoyed it, business culture, counterculture, and the rise of hip consumerism, and not only because I lived through that process where the Cultural Revolution of the 60s was co-opted by Madison Avenue, but because I see a parallel between your book about the Democratic Party, Listen, Liberal, and The Conquest of Cool, which is a movement of one nature, an organization of one nature being co-opted by a different group. Is that reading too much into your new book?
No, all of these books are. It's exactly right, and all of these books are deal with the same. This is my sweet spot. This is the period that I know a lot about, and the process that I know a lot about. And so you see, the Conquest of Cool returns in Listen, Liberal. There's a whole chapter called "The Hipster and the Banker Should Be Friends."
Right.
And it's basically, it is what I was talking about in The Conquest of Cool that's happening in the 60s, has been going on ever since then, and has actually taken on this sort of weird political edge. Or I should say, it's not the edge, it's like the opposite of an edge, you know?
Right, it's a softening, it's a rounding, a kind of a homogenization process. Is that?
Yeah.
So, listen, I enjoyed both books very much, and I wanted to ask you too that I the parallels also include the sort of co-optation for economic reasons of certain movements, but as I understand the thesis of Listen, Liberal, is basically that the Democratic Party, which used to be the party of, in the gendered language of the past, the working man or the working people, is now basically, if the Republican Party is the party of the 1%, Democrats are the party of the 10%, the professional class. Fair summary?
That's right. That's exactly right. That is it in a nutshell. And this is a change that happened out in the open. The Democrats talk about it all the time, but for whatever reason, the general public doesn't really know it. And so they have this idea of who the Democrats are, and then they're continually disappointed, when the Democrats don't deliver. The problem is they're not who we think they are.
Right. And I think that's important. I maybe this is a little narcissistic, but one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was that it seemed to put words to thoughts or feelings I'd had but never had entirely verbalized. But people sometimes summarize the stance of the so-called centrist Democrats or the Democrats that have been in power as, let's say, economically neoliberal or whatever. Yeah. But you really come at it, and that may or may not be fair, but you really come at it more from a cultural angle, saying that, well, they've internalized the culture of a professional class with everything that implies, including the privileging of higher education, maybe even postgraduate education, and certain other beliefs. It's really a belief system, isn't it?
Yes. So I would say I come at it from a sociological angle, although I never, really studied sociology per se, but, I did read a lot of it for this book. And that is exactly what it is. So instead of it being, a sort of a failure by Democrats or a conscious betrayal by Democrats or the conquest of the party by one faction, it's a kind of idealism that you see in these guys. And idealism, they're doing exactly what they want to do and what they think is the right thing to do. It just doesn't happen to be, they're not doing it for you. You see, they're doing it out of a concern with their own social cohort. And once I sort of stumbled or happened upon this theory, this hypothesis, the Democrats are the party of the professional class, all the pieces fit together. It was kind of weird, so the story of the book is that the Democrats are a class party, but the class in question is not the working class; it's the professional class, and they mirror or exemplify the outlook of the professional class in nearly every respect. And you mentioned the reverence for education, but you go down the list, the pining for consensus, which is so so strong in Obama and Clinton before him, and sort of so pathetic also, and you see it in Hillary as well.
Right.
And there's so many other characteristics, the reverence for expertise, for orthodox expertise, I should say.
That to me, if I can jump in for a second, Thomas Frank.
It's your show. I'm the one that should be shutting up all the time.
No. Listen, we're not that kind of show. It seems to me that the pernicious myth of that there can be a technocratic solution is also very much a part of that. The idea that if we just study the data, all reasonable people will arrive at the same conclusion.
Yes. Oh, my God. That's exactly what it is. And if you ever read the Washington Post, that is the prevailing attitude of the Washington Post, that politics just gets in the way. And it's a funny attitude for a newspaper that in Washington, D.C., but there it is. And it's also the attitude of the Democratic Party, and especially of their leaders. Now, hilariously, it's not the attitude of the Republican Party. And so there's this kind of fruitless, reaching out for grand bargains and for these consensus, and the Republicans just stiff them time and again.
Well, of course, yes, of course. I mean, so many people have compared it to Lucy and the Charlie Brown and the football and all that.
Yes.
But as we're talking, I'm sort of imagining three concentric rings, and at the center of the center ring is the 1%, and they have the Republican Party and the 0.01% to represent them. Then around that is this professional class that you describe, and I really love that kind of hook. I think it makes a lot of sense. But within that, since we're talking about the so-called bipartisan solutions and so on, within that 10% and the 1% inside it, there's a lot of shared belief, or at least.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, so what you're getting at is. The argument that I make in the book is that when we're trying to understand inequality and why it goes on and on and on, and why both parties don't really seem to do anything about it, the problem is not just the 1%, the Koch brothers and the Walton family. It's the 10%. So you look at who's done well in the recovery, and it is all the gains of the recovery have gone to the top 10%. The top 10% is the mass constituency for inequality. These are people for whom this world of inequality that we're living in, it treats them pretty well. They like it. They like what they see. And these people, by and large, are not Republicans. They're Democrats. This is the top of the professional class, and they've done well.
And we're talking with Thomas Frank, the author of Listen Liberal. And to what extent does identity politics figure into this? You write in the book about the glass ceiling and that we should be having a conversation about the glass floor, and that, of course, is important. But there's a sense that as long as people from a variety, this is my interpretation, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as long as people from a variety of groups are allowed to penetrate that ceiling, and, for example, when the presidency or other high offices, that's of less concern than the many people in and out of those groups or of greater concern, I should say, than the many people who are struggling to survive. It's almost a symbolic.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's right. And the word for that is meritocracy. So meritocracy is the sort of the first commandment of the professional class. The idea that the talented, the people at the top are there because they're the best, because they're talented. And their talent is defined by where they went to college or where they went to graduate school or some kind of professional achievement, something like that. That's how it's not how, they work their way up on the job or something like that. It's how they did in school. And if you really believe in meritocracy, the great injustice that you see out there is that there are, and this is, by the way, Hillary Clinton says this all the time, that there are these sort of artificial barriers that keep people of talent from rising to the top, whether we're talking about racism or sexism or some other inherited belief that stops people who deserve to rise from rising. And that's fine. That's a perfectly legitimate. And it's something I would agree with. The problem with it is, with that doctrine, that ideology, is it offers nothing to the people who are not super talented and who didn't go to a fancy college, or who maybe are talented and don't have the right credential, or there's a million things that can go wrong in a human being's life, and they aren't successful. And this kind of liberalism has very little to offer those people.
Right. And in the in the world of the jungle, the lion always thinks it's a meritocracy. It doesn't.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
So I guess what we're dealing with, and I struggle with this. For example, I think sometimes I think it's cynicism and pandering to contributors, but political contributors and so on. But a lot more of the time, I agree that it is cultural in a sense. And I think about it when there's a phrase I hate, Thomas Frank. And the phrase came up, for example, when Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were debating their respective college financing programs. And I always do the disclaimer, I do write for Bernie Sanders. But and the phrase is this, that Hillary said she thought people needed to pay a percentage of the tuition because it's important for people to have, and I quote, skin in the game.
Lord.
To me, skin in the game is a phrase that is freighted with the ideology of this professional class. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and it's also it's fascinating to me that she doesn't think higher ed should be free. So I presumably thinks high school should be free.
Right.
And presumably she thinks elementary school should be free. But when you get to college, you need to hit that wall and start borrowing money. Now, why would someone think that? Her generation basically went to college for free.
Right.
If you go back and look at what it cost to go to Berkeley in 1969 or whatever it was when Hillary graduated, the price tag was zero, or very, very close to zero. And today, it's out of control all across this country. And the idea that that's somewhat legitimate. Well, this is also basic class. Basic class identification. College administrators are one of the groups that is, most closely identified with the Democratic Party, and this is another one of these groups that they treat with kid gloves. You're talking about Big Pharma, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, and another one is college administrators. Now, the funny thing is, all four of the groups that I just mentioned are essentially groups that are out of control, that are gouging the American public, that are just ripping people off left and right. Big Pharma, or spying on us, Silicon Valley, or the college administrators, jacking up tuition another 5% every year, and these are all costs that we're basically forced or required to pay nowadays.
And I cannot resist pointing out that Larry Summers, in addition to being that Clinton's chief economic advisor, was also the president of Harvard.
That was later on, yeah. He went from being Secretary of the Treasury under Clinton, where he was this big-time deregulator, really believed in bank deregulation, one after another deregulatory act in the Clinton years, all which became terrible, crashing failures, by the way. Then he became president of Harvard. Then he worked at a hedge fund. Then he was in the Obama administration. Then they brought him back. It's mind-boggling. It's a meritocracy of failure.
Right.
They brought this guy back, and he screwed up again.
Well, to me, and I've used this, and I'll probably use it again, but to me, it's a kind of Mandarin philosophy that says that if you pass the test and get admitted to the Mandarin class, you're in.
It's a class thing. That is that is the critical word. It's a class thing. And the thing about social class is, even if we don't believe in it, even if we don't want to talk about it, even if we don't acknowledge it, it's still there, and it is pervasive. And it is pervasive in the way these people think about the world, even though they don't want to acknowledge that they're part of a social class. They don't like to think that they're part of a group. They think, we're where we are because we're the best.
Right.
And I'm here to say that the things they do are because of this, the outlook of this particular social class that they're all part of.
I think that's a great observation. Crazy question for you, and
by the way, I should skip in here and say I'm a part of that class as well.
Well, I think many of us are, but you're class conscious. I didn't see anywhere in the book the explanation of the title, and the only thing you will know this, many people won't, but only thing it reminded me of was "Listen, Yankee" by C. Wright Mills.
Well, that's where it comes from.
Okay, it does. I was going to ask you.
Well, in part, it comes from that. In part, there's a bunch of different sources, but there's that, and there was a funny incident that happened to me in Wichita some years ago. I was It was when What's the Matter with Kansas came out, and I was down in Wichita promoting the book, and I remember a local newspaper columnist or something I forget what his job was, but he was a local journalist of some kind, and he was supposed to come and interview me, and he came by my hotel early in the morning. We were going to meet for breakfast, and he rang my hotel, the telephone in my hotel room. He's down in the lobby, and I picked up the phone, and he says, "Rise and shine, liberal."
All right. So listen.
And I always thought that was kind of amusing. So
it is. That would have been a good title too, by the way. But so I have to ask you this: has anyone else mentioned the C. Wright Mills book to you on this tour?
I've told a number of people.
Right, but has anyone asked you? This is just my vanity.
I think you're the first.
All right. Okay. Well, the book, listen, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. It was a pleasure to read the book. The book is Listen Liberal, or Whatever Happened to the Party of the People. Thomas Frank, thanks so much for joining us.
The pleasure is all mine.